Joining us right now to start this conversation is Dr. Ron Paul, chairman of the Campaign for Liberty, former member of Congress, and former presidential candidate in thorn in the side of the Republican Party. I think we can say that as well. Dr. Paul, it's great to have you with us.
Thank you. Nice to be with you.
Always a pleasure to talk to you, sir. And I want to focus on the plane crash. There are, a lot of folks suspecting that Russia somehow involved directly or indirectly here, and at least these pro-Russian separatists are involved. What do you think the reaction and response should be from the current administration?
Go cautiously, because under these circumstances it's very, very difficult to get the real information. So everybody's angling to propagandize and make their position known. So I think it'd be unwise to say, well, the Russians did it, or the Ukraine government did it, or the rebels did it. I do know, though, that it's pretty evident that the whole problem in Ukraine started approximately a year ago when the Europeans and along with the United States overthrew an elected government and threw Yanukovych. And since then, they've been in civil strife over there. So there's a lot of turmoil there, and it's going to be very difficult. But the other question I ask is, who would benefit the most from this? And of course, if it's blamed on Russia, then of course the Ukraine government would get the most benefits. But since Russia would have the least benefits, I think Putin is a little bit smarter than that. I don't think he would ever come close to participating in an act like this.
Yeah, and I think that's probably the common sense thing to say here. But at the same time, there have been these new sanctions from the White House. There have been a lot of fingers pointed in Putin's direction for if not directly being involved, but being complicit with the fact that some of these weapons, he might turn his back to it, but they're Russian weapons.
That may well be true, but guess what? ISIS has a lot of American weapons. We sent weapons into...
That some of these weapons, he might turn his back to it, but they're Russian weapons.
That may well be true, but guess what? ISIS has a lot of American weapons. We sent weapons into Syria to help the rebels, and the Al-Qaeda ends up getting it. It doesn't mean that our American government and Obama deliberately wanted ISIS to get American weapons. So who gets the weapons is a big difference between how they got them and what happened and what the motivations were. So even if it was a Russian weapon, it doesn't mean a lot. But I think, once again, we're a long way from that. I think it's interesting that the way that the flight was changed, make it land in Russia, and then it would have been a greater detriment to the Russians, and the Cold War could be resumed. There's a lot of people itching for the Cold War, and they don't want to do anything to even talk with the Russians. They want to put on these sanctions, which are actually acts of war, and the consequences usually economic blowback. And right now, the Chamber of Commerce and national manufacturers are anxious to lay off these sanctions. But of course, sanctions ratchet it up. Mm-hmm. And then you say, yeah, they made the Russians mad. Now the Russians are retaliating. But quite frankly, we're a long way off. I do know, though, from my experience in the last 30 years or so, that every fight that we've gotten into was almost always based on lies, and of course,
well, yeah, you bring that up, Dr. Paul, because we can look back on Hillary Clinton. I want to mention what she said last night on the Charlie Rose show real quickly to get your take on it. But she supported the Iraq War. She has not been afraid, while she was a senator, to take a stance of intervention, at least in the year she served in the upper chamber on Capitol Hill. Let's play the clip from Hillary Clinton's appearance last night on the Charlie Rose show, and we'll get your take on the other side,
okay.
Dr. Paul.
Good.
I think that the first question is, what does Europe do? Right. I think the United States has been very clear in both its criticism of Russia and Putin, its support for Poroshenko and the new Ukrainian government, and there has just been a new round of sanctions that President Obama himself has announced. If there is evidence linking Russia to this, that should inspire the Europeans to do much more on 3 counts. 1, toughen their own sanctions, make it very clear there has to be a price to pay. Number 2, immediately accelerate efforts and announce they are doing so to find alternatives to Gazprom. Russia has not diversified its economy. It is still largely dependent upon natural resources, principally gas and oil. And thirdly, do more in concert with us to support the Ukrainians.
So there you have it there. The very beginning of that, Dr. Paul, might sound like something that you would say, or your son, Senator Rand Paul, would say, or something you mentioned at the very onset of this interview. Use caution.
Yeah, I noticed that and thought, oh, okay, yeah, it looks like I can agree with her. But then she went too far.
Well, yes, of course. But I wanted to focus on that first part because it does seem like she seems to be in tune with what you've been in tune to for a long time and what your son is in tune to, this lack of real want on the American people to get involved in these types of situations.
Maybe we're halfway there, you know, getting other people to come in our direction. But then she goes in and she fully endorses the sanctions, and we got to get not be intimidated by Gazprom, and we can put the sanctions on. And then we should have build-up of our own supplies. Well, it could take 3 or 4 years for that to happen. And right now, to me, it's amazing that the Europeans are risking so much. Matter of fact, the Americans are risking a lot more than they realize because there is a currency war going on, and the full effect hasn't been felt yet. But they are starting to use currencies other than the dollar, and we have pushed the Russians right into the hands of the Chinese and the Indians, and they want something different than the dollar, and that may be a more powerful weapon than all these bombs that people are concerned about.
Well, I do want to talk to you a little bit more about the Fed and Janet Yellen in just a second, but let's stay with this issue of Ukraine, and because I got another statement here from a former State Department official, David Kramer, talking about how he believes the U.S. needs to respond to this crash. And he says in part, quote, "I think the West has to say the gloves are coming off. I think and hope that at a minimum, the U.S. and Europe significantly widen their sanctions. That seems to be a minimal step to this to impose sectorial sanctions." Again, we go back to sanctions here, not military operation here. You say these sanctions are just as dangerous?
No, every bit as much, if not more, because they're very seductive. And this is just war talk, warmongering. If we get into a fight with a country and war breaks out, the first thing we do is put on sanctions and blockade them and try to keep resources out of their country. So if you start with that, I consider this an act of war. It's not quite like shooting at each other. But
the sanctions you're talking about being an act of war.
The what?
The sanctions?
Oh, yeah, because what happens if China comes into the Gulf of Mexico and they want to punish up? What if they're in the driver's seat and they say, you're not allowed to have any more oil imports or you can't export your oil? Do you think, what would the Americans do? It would be hysterical. I mean, we'd be at war because that would be an act of war. But we do it all the time. We do it, and people that you just quoted there, they're just looking for an acceleration of the Cold War, which are going to make it a hot war, because there's a lot of interest involved, there's energy involved, there's money involved, there's a military-industrial complex involved, and there's this attitude that we have this moral responsibility to be the kingpin and bring about peace and democracy to the world like we did to Iraq. Just look at the results. They're so bad. But they believe this sincerely. They believe in promoting America's greatness and its authoritarianism around the world as much as I believe we ought to trade with people and talk to them and take the founders' advice that you should have peaceful trade and friendship with countries. That's what we should be talking about, not how are we going to escalate the war. But these threats and the intimidations, they're going to go badly because this country, our country, is in bankruptcy and we're in big trouble and it's going to backfire. And even the business people who are considered very unlibertarian and conservatives are now very worried about the ramifications. How about the $500 billion worth of investments we have in Russia? I mean, what's going to happen when Putin gets a little bit tough with us? He's going to come down on it, and we're going to suffer. Americans always suffer from sanctions. All of the lost exports that we've lost, not being able to trade with Cuba and Iran, and now Russia. So we suffer, and it's usually not noticed.
Now and you've been right about many of these issues in the past, and that's why your movement has gained so much popularity and continues underneath your son's banner as well. Let's talk about Janet Yellen's testimony before the House Financial Services Committee this week. You have said, in the words of Yogi Berra, that it's deja vu all over again. What was your initial takeaway from hearing Yellen speak?
Well, it was really the same old stuff again. You know, at one time she was for transparency until she got some positions of power. And also, she at one time talked about a rule. She was more sympathetic, but now that she's in charge, she doesn't want a rule. But I don't want a rule either. I want the market to determine interest rates. I don't want the Congress or have a Taylor rule that think that you can, do this by prescription run by the Congress. So it's all bad. But so she shifts back and forth, but she is a money manager, and she believes in inflation, and things are going to, and they will not improve under her leadership because it isn't the fact that she's inept; it's the system.
Yeah. So the picture,
impossible to work.
Dr. Paul, the picture she painted for Congress, too rosy in your opinion?
Oh yeah, I think that they always do that. They're always talking about how wonderful it is, and there's no inflation, and oh yeah, there's a little bit, and we got to pay attention, but we're going to quit QE, but we're not going to raise interest rates. How do you do that? You have to buy something else and that's where the real culprit is, and that is the fixing of interest rates. Price fixing is horrible in a market economy, and here we price fix 1/2 of everything that we do, and that is the price of money, and that is why we get into the troubles that we're in today.
Well, Dr. Paul, we thank you so much for your time here, and a lot of folks say there's way too much attention put on these appearances by the head chairman or the Fed chairman before Congress. So anyway, great to talk to you, sir. We'll have you back very soon here on the program. Dr. Ron Paul there talking about how we should be cautious moving ahead in the situation in Ukraine. We're back with more right after this.